And we're gonna go live on YouTube. Okay, that's it. So what you see there.
Yeah.
Okay, volume's on. Yep.
All right. Everyone, thank you for coming today. And I know that this is pretty significant and that there are many of us that each other in person for so I'm going to tell you that many of you might not recognize me or remember me. I was with you for a very short period of time, and October, November, December of this year, for the department that October as the for comprehensive planning. Came on the comp team, started up with working with the group on the zoning code rewrite, attended your November advisory committee meeting. So I was also very friendly in the room. And so you might have recognized me. So went through a little bit of a transition there where I took up from maternity leave, 1-month-old, and started back up with the department 2.5 weeks ago. So awesome to be back. And then during that time was another COVID and the huge amount of outreach that happened on module 2. So if anything, just want to say hello and let you know that I'm back. But use this as an opportunity to thank all of you for your ongoing involvement with the committee, because I know it's been a long road, and the task at hand that you had signed up for in the beginning has become a much more extended version of that task. So we appreciate you continuing to show up and participate in these conversations, and not just this conversation, but also all of the community events that have been happening around the city for the past 3 months. So thank you for your time. And then also, I do want to pause and thank staff, Deanna, Leanna, Andrea, and Lindsay in particular for all of their work at a significant number of community meetings and events over the past 3 months. And Lindsay has a breakdown of just how many conversations were held, how many people they've chatted with, different ways that they've been receiving input on module 2. And it was a heck of a job that they did. And so I unfortunately was only watching from the sides, but hope to be much more involved from here on out with the team as we move forward with module 1, module 2, module 3, eventually code that we use for adoption in the city. So if anything, welcome. Wanted to also touch on the housekeeping for the meeting itself. This is our first hybrid meeting, and make just a special call out for those. Already hitting one of my asks is that if anyone online has a question, please raise their hand with that little button. And then also we're going to limit the chat feature on Zoom just because it's hard to track with the different conversations online and then in the room. So for those folks online, if you can do that. And then were there other, I think that was about it. There are refreshments and goodies, and then a nice tumbler as a sign of appreciation for your involvement with this process that please pick up on your way out or during the meeting. With that, I'm going to turn it over to our fearless leader, Tim Keene, who I hope many of you have had the opportunity to meet with, and if not, there will be many more opportunities ongoing, but comes from Atlanta. He's here in our lovely city, and he has some great visions to share with all of you.
Thank you, Jessica. Nice to meet you if I haven't already. Appreciate it. And I'm only going to be here for a few minutes. You probably know we have the city council public hearings going on right now regarding the shelter on State Street, and I'll be returning for that. But wanted to take a moment to start by again thanking you. This is the ultimate public service, serving on a group like this, volunteering to talk about the next zoning ordinance for your city. You also signed up for that, and we really appreciate it. That's a special kind of public service, and it's so important. I mean, you know that this isn't trivial work. This is will have such an impact on the city and your neighborhood. So it's hugely important, but it's tough. It's emotional and can be tedious at times and all those kinds of things. So we greatly appreciate your service to the community. And I wanted to say, and I think the discussion today is going to be a lot about kind of what's been learned over the first 2 modules. A couple things I wanted to say about it. One is that we feel a great responsibility to respond to the public discussion that has occurred and work with you on how do we move from where we are, which there's been a lot of productive discussion that needs to happen, but to a proposal that is probably more Boise centric. What I mean by that is my characterization of it would be that what has been discussed so far is fairly cookie cutter in the sense that it applies the same kind of standards everywhere as a solution. And I don't think you need to do that and still get to these issues that we all care about in the city. And so the staff here that Jessica referenced is incredibly talented and dedicated, has been working on that to come up with ways that we can substantially respond to this public discussion in ways that we think people will really be compelled by. And so we're excited to kind of enter this phase with you. The idea is we're going to hold a little bit on module 3 so we can discuss 1 and 2 again, which is I think what the discussion really today is about, what we learned from that, and be able to say, hey, listen, 1 and 2, we had all these public meetings, there was an initial proposal, we heard all this feedback from people. It was, in a lot of cases, very specific feedback that we now, so let's take that and come back and say, this is what we learned, and this is where we think we need to go with the ordinance. And there could be aspects of it that are substantially different than where we were. But that's what the process is about, right? I mean, that's why all the public meetings happen, so that we can have those discussions. Again, the issues were ones that we must discuss. How do you deal with housing affordability and density in the city? How does that affect people's mobility? You know, issues around conservation of land, everything was very, you know, public services in response to the growing density in the city and more people that are living here. All of these things are important. So let's take that and you know, the value of that and shift to some degree in terms of where we go. So we want you to help us do that. So, I mean, the discussion today is about what did we learn and where should we go with that in a way that people could get compelled by, because the whole idea of this, the reason for investing so much in this is to get to a place where many of you, if ideally all of you, feel like we've got something that is dramatically better than what we have today in the context of where the city is right now. So we need to spend time on this. So we want to get this right with you. And today's discussion will be about that. So who is going to go next? Lindsay, I'm assuming. Thank you for listening, and glad I got to meet you if I hadn't already, and look forward to more of this work.
Yeah, thanks, Tim. Hi, everyone. It's nice to see you all. I'm just going to give a quick recap of the last 3 months and what we've done. I've pretty much seen all your faces at our outreach events, which we really appreciate you guys being involved in the extensive outreach that we did. So I think most of you took a couple of surveys that we put out. We did do 2 different surveys. One was more community focused and one was more technical. We had over 3,000 responses take the community survey. In comparison, the module 1 survey had about 1,100. So that's a substantial increase. And we were able to track a lot of where those responses came from, which was pretty cool. community conversations, we headed out to 7 of the neighborhood planning areas specifically and had some of those examples that we had from an architect as well that kind of broke down what those 7 major changes look like on the local level. We had a little bit over 200 attendees just at those. And then we also had those targeted and community events. Those were anywhere from ULI groups to Boise Young Professionals groups to Boise State students. Roberta got us a couple housing groups and climate groups, and even more detailed conversations with Boise State and some of you all in the room. So we appreciate all of your input and then bringing groups to us as well. That really helps us reach a broader sense of the community. Postcards, we did some targeted postcards. We know that renters aren't a huge group that we hear from. So Deanna put together a great kind of GIS map that we were able to target. We decided kind of an area of 15,000 different mailers that could go out within those groups. And then we were actually able to track that a huge portion of that was actually taken in the survey, which is pretty cool for us to be able to track and see where there's a lot of return on our investment. We also have an internal newsletter that goes out to about 13,000 different folks in the community. That was probably included at least 4 or 5 times in our internal newsletter that goes out. And then we also have a substantial list that comes from PDFs of everybody that we do interactions with, and that's targeted in our Building Boise newsletter that was focused on zoning code as well. And then kudos to our 3 planners that answer all of the emails and calls that go out as well. Over 100 resident emails that they spend substantial time responding, especially a lot of specific questions that they get, and then phone calls as well. So again, just another interactive. This doesn't even cover the entire picture. This is just overall kind of by the numbers that we did some outreach. So super excited and proud of what we've done. We're excited about moving forward. So that's just my little spiel. And oh yeah.
The survey, were you able to determine where the respondents were from?
Yes. So the first couple of questions, I actually brought a copy of the results too, in case anybody want to see from both the surveys. The community survey was great across the board. I think in the first, like I always compare it to the module 1 survey because that's what I have easiest to comparison to. We heard a lot from the north and east end. It was probably equal between West Bench, Central Bench, and North and East End. And then obviously foothills, you know, it's a smaller demographic though too. So obviously those numbers play into it. We're still working on the outreach report. We'll get that out here probably in the next couple of weeks. But yeah, I have some of those results you can see. So we asked where you live, what type of home you live in, and then whether you're a renter or a homeowner. Those are the only 3 demographic type questions that we asked. Yeah.
How do the results relate to what you were kind of expecting to get back feedback?
Yeah, I would say so far from like the first couple of glances of diving in, it's been a little bit more positive compared to the in-person feedback that we've received, but still the same concerns. Like parking was a major concern in person, and that still was highlighted on like one of the most important things when they had to rank different areas of importance in the city. So that was more interesting than I thought, that people really parking is important. Yeah. Roberta.
Can you repeat the numbers between module 1 and module 2? I heard 1,000 something from.
Yeah, I believe, and it's online too, I can double check that, but I believe the module 1 survey was about 1,100 survey responses. And then this one we had a little over 3,100 and then 49 technical. So just about 3,200 total.
And just to give you a comparison, Ada County with their module 1 survey results, they came in with about 750. And then they're just going through module 2, 3, all combined and consolidated. So we'll have their numbers a little bit later.
Any other questions?
So
Yeah.
I'm just curious, I mean, do you think that the increase in participation is just as a result of more public awareness because it's been on the table more?
Yeah, that too. That's something else I didn't include in here. Some of the earned media that we've had, we had quite a few people interested as well. Just Boise Dev did an article right away. I know Statesman picked it up, and some of the news stations. Yes, absolutely. I mean, the more, you know, some of those outlets can spread the word about our events, the broader reach that we're able to reach. I would say the postcard and our internal newsletter are to the highest return on investments that we receive. Of course, mailers are expensive, but you know, we kind of did it more targeted this time that we thought was kind of worth our money in this instance. So yeah. Yes, Roberta.
So with the postcards, like I work with the Southeast Neighborhood Association, that doesn't count as an inclusion, because that was 40,000.
Yeah, which is a great point. And that's what it was like. This is, I'm still putting together our entire post report that includes, like, I believe we include on the Southeast when it was like, hey, can we include this? Yes, we're super grateful for those opportunities. But yeah, that's just our direct
Okay,
mailer that
that's
we did
helpful to know.
ourselves. Yeah,
Thank you.
yep. So great point, even larger reach.
And I would say, module 1, we did not do a postcard survey or a postcard mailer. And I mean, sending 15,000 postcards out is huge. Whenever we do neighborhood plans, a postcard mailer, we get the most responses from.
Anybody else? Cool. I'll hand it back over to Jessica. And again, once we kind of create our post out report, we'll make sure to email that to you guys, but we're still compiling all of the data that we have.
Yeah, so really what the rest of our time here today is to kind of build off of that we had a lot of conversations. Staff is summarizing the feedback, but many of you were at a lot of these conversations. And so we wanted to spend some time to kind of, and we have suggestions for like where the topic areas of some of those conversations that you've overheard have generally fallen, but we wanted to hear from you all about like what your impressions were of how those conversations went and what the bigger topical areas are, feedback you're hearing from the community, as kind of like the next part of this discussion. And then as we kind of identify those areas and like, you know, parking, like let's have a conversation a little bit more about parking, like what actually were some of the hot button issues or concerns that people had or opportunities that were identified, just so we can start to kind of work through that together as a group, and then make sure that we're also incorporating that as a part of the outreach into what will then go into the revision for module 1 and module 2. And I have markers and a planner's favorite tool.
So I just want to be clear what the ask is, right? So on the one hand, are you asking us, one, what we heard, or because there was also, that's one set of interesting things. There's also what did we think of module 2, right? So I think you asked us all what, from our perspective, that we bring to this. Like, what was your take on module 2? What did you think was good? What did you think? So I'm just, because I would have two different answers, right? In terms of what did I hear when I went to community meetings, and then what was my take on the proposal?
I almost was thinking that it would be interesting to think about it from what was my take on module 2? And then I went to these community meetings and that was confirmed through the conversation, or I was surprised that I actually heard something different. Because I think that's how we're kind of approaching it too. Like, this is what we think, this is what we thought module 2 was about. We go into the meetings and we have our impression of, you know, what kind of city that would develop into, but then somebody can come at it from a completely different angle. So were there any aha moments that you recall over the last 3 months of outreach that you felt interesting? It might not, and then kind of how did that compare to originally what you were working on?
Okay.
Sorry, David, what are you doing?
And
Daniel got it.
Daniel, yeah, we should all, names, you know, we should all like say our names. I'm Daniel.
And Jessica, just for people online, maybe whatever our CAC members say, if we could repeat close to the mic, just to make sure they pick up everything.
Yeah.
Hybrid is difficult to do, so we're doing our best here.
And the only mic is here.
Yes,
Okay.
and I can move this a little closer
I
too.
will take notes.
Okay.
If that would be helpful.
Sure, yeah.
for you.
Variety of.
And I guess the only thing I want to add to it too, just kind of like setting up, as Jessica mentioned, like we have these sort of proposed topics as we were going through it. Like these are some of the really high level buckets that we found and reviewing a lot of the feedback. But please don't see that as a limit as to like what we can discuss here. Like a big part of having this conversation today is also like just getting that sort of raw impression and raw feedback from you as well. So it could be that what you're interested in talking about falls under one of these categories, or it could be something that you feel is totally different and feel empowered to choose your own adventure in that sense.
Guys, I don't want to be disruptive here, but so you can just shut me down. But here's the thing. You all have been asking us for our opinions. I mean, we've given you a lot of feedback.
Yeah.
Personally, I've been to surveys, sent you letters. We've all done that. We've all had, so I think it doesn't feel like this is like to hear more of this from us. Like I need to I'm curious on what are you guys thinking? And like,
We didn't want to give up the goat.
well, I know, I mean, it's like, at some point, like, it's like, I don't know, maybe y'all disagree with me, but I'm just, it's like, you know, we're, like, we gotta move, anyway, I'm happy to say what I've said already.
No, I really appreciate it. But for housekeeping purposes, we all go around and clear name.
Sure, Daniel Malarkey.
Thank you.
Byron Falwell, architect. Ian McLaughlin.
Kelly Tag, Roberta D'Amico,
Brad Nielsen.
Francis Fuji,
Esther Seha.
Marissa Keith,
Drew Alexander.
Andrea Tuning.
And then online,
Patrick Spouts.
Patrick. If I step here.
Uh,
Oh, there you go.
Richard Llewellyn's here.
Hello, Richard.
Chris Vanderstow.
Hello, Chris. That's it. And Jamie.
That's our Jamie right there.
Oh, our Jamie. Oh,
Just
hi.
migrate.
Sorry, yeah. Okay, so, and I'll try to, it's kind of a weird spot to stand right in front of the camera, but, okay, I like completely appreciate your comments and.
I mean, it's fine, I just like, if we all go around, I just like, we've got 2 hours,
Sure,
right?
right, yeah.
So if we all want us, we just want an hour articulating, I do feel like we want to start converging on something, and I know you do too.
Definitely, well, I think we'll get more to that, conversational piece where we're engaging with you on what we're thinking of where to go next and your thoughts on all of that, because, for the sake of the extras, like you are subject matter experts on the zoning code rewrite more than a lot of people, but we need to do this together, you know, and have a two-way conversation. And I think that's really at the heart of what we want to do. But I'm kind of curious, just kind of like get the brain by working of, did anyone have that like aha moment or wow, that was completely different than I thought? Yeah.
I'll start. I have to leave soon. I'm going to jump on Zoom. But I attended 2 of the meetings, one at the library and one out at West Junior High conference committee, and they were very different in tone. I think probably because the people there at the library was a lot of people that were on this committee, a lot of city council, very nice meeting. I feel like Southwest was more not quite so happy. And I think a lot of that comes from a lot of the trust issues that that area has with the city. But I think overall people liked the design elements that they saw. Like you showed a picture of what could happen next to the Fred Meyers. That's not what's going next to the Fred Meyers. So that might be an issue when people see that now. But people like that sort of thing, but they're just not really trusting that that's what's going to be.
Okay, that's a good point. So yeah, different tones at different meetings. I think, I don't know where to capture it, but like assurance on what we're doing is actually then what we're building.
And they like the walkable communities, like there was some communication about like, the detached sidewalks, the wide pathways, people like that stuff, but that's not, and I mean, there's definitely problems with the current code, because we're not getting that stuff now, and that's what people want.
Yes, maybe like quality control, quality assurance, like how do we follow up on those projects, make sure they're built to the standard that we want them to be.
On mixed use zones, they weren't talked a whole lot at the community meetings, but I've been in some discussions with other groups at like Bus District Neighborhood Association on campus where I spend most of my days. And I think the aha moment I've had with that is that it feels almost like we are missing a zone, a mixed use zone.
Yeah.
There's a very stark change from MXD to the next most intense zone. And it feels when you look at the conversion map, we're stretching some of these proposed zones rather thin. Like you have mixed use neighborhood over areas like Park Center Boulevard, and would actually be downzoning those areas with that application. The Lust District's feedback was, you don't feel like a street zone or this pocket of downtown. We want flexibility, but there's kind of this ceiling that you hit until you get into MXD. So what I'm hearing is that a lot of these areas like that are going to be asking to maybe go to MXD or encourage the creation of another transitional zone that isn't quite as stark from MXD down to whatever is next. Maybe it's the activity center, I think. But I think we have many areas that are on the fringes of town that would benefit from something like that. And then allow the other proposed zones to really hone in on those specific corridors or activity centers identified in Blueprint Boise, those types of things. So.
Can I just piggyback off of that? So one of the things that that we talked about in a couple of neighborhood association meetings is the R3 zoning. It's a high density zoning. And, so R3 zone could be a 400 unit apartment complex, which by the nature of itself, it requires the people that live there to get in a car and leave to go to any service or whatever. But in areas like, I live in the west, downtown in the West End, we've been talking a lot about this. We also have R3 in smaller residential areas where a 400 unit apartment complex wouldn't possibly fit. So it doesn't make sense that we would both use the same definition for the same zones. So, if there is another possibility for a different zone where to discourage these really large apartment complexes, it makes more sense to have a mixed use. If we're really going to have something where it's walkable and connected and that sort of thing. And in neighborhoods like ours, where something like that wouldn't fit, something that's a different type of density, but still, apartment complexes that might be more appropriate for a smaller residential setting. So
Yeah.
something sort of in between.
Great, and so to kind of catch up the two, because those two are actually really pretty important to Bob. We have heard that and we feel like too that there isn't enough differentiation between the mixed zones, and that also applies to the residential zones as well, that there's just subtle enough differences that you kind of almost sometimes can get the same product within the same residential zone, so you don't really know how we're preserving single family homes in maybe a traditional way that we're thinking of it, but then how do we accommodate denser type of housing that isn't just a large apartment building. So in the mixed use zones too, that we know downtown, we understand MXD, but then it kind of just falls off to be something very different anywhere else in the city. And so
Yeah.
if you had a choice between, am I going to go to that height and that density versus the other, there's no steps in between. And then the other point being about where does the investment and that type of development make sense? Because that is the nature of that area, whereas kind of the blanket, more cookie cutter approach across the city. And so we definitely heard that. So a little bit of work within clearly separating out what is in each zone, and then where do those zones go? So I'd say absolutely that's where we are focusing then our attention of okay, so then how do you think about that?
Just to play with that a little bit, it seems like we're bumping up against the limits of Euclidean zoning in some ways. When Euclidean zoning is applied geographically throughout the city, but not according to development patterns, historic development patterns, that's kind of what you get is this broad brush stroke across an area that doesn't account for how the neighborhood was set up.
Yeah, definitely true. Yeah.
Yeah, also on the mixed use zones, I feel like we really started engaging with the conversion map. Everyone could really latch on to how it was going to affect their projects. So I've gotten a lot of feedback from the development community, including at 2ULI events that Andrew and I spoke at. Some of the feedback just mirrors what we heard from City Council, that the mixed use zones aren't going far enough in terms of density and increasing height limits. We aren't increasing height limits in very many of the mixed use zones, except for MXA as it relates to C2. And then for some zones, like the PC, LO, or RO, we're actually lowering the height limits in some circumstances. I've heard a lot from the folks in the shoreline district along the river in kind of the downtown periphery that as an RO zone, they're going to convert to MXA and would like to be considered for the MXD or maybe some other transitional zone. And then the MXA zone itself, and I spoke about this on one of the Zooms, I think it's just been mapped too liberally onto the conversion map based on where the community nodes are in the Blueprint Boise. And some of those community centers are just like a church. Maybe doesn't warrant a 1/8 mile stretch in all directions of an MXA zone. So I think that could be revisited.
Or maybe it does, but it's not. There's different types of activity centers
Yeah.
in theory, right? Like there's an area where there's a library and a park and a school, and we want to make sure that that's a pedestrian friendly environment, but it doesn't maybe come with the same height that like an activity center that is, you know, office buildings with apartments with commercial ground floor is. They're kind of different.
Yeah, more of a medium intensity
Right.
transit associated with it.
Right, yeah. I'm trying to be part of that.
I got a lot of feedback on the parking maximums as well. How the
Mhm.
parking maximums are being reduced by 20 to 40%
Mhm.
in a lot of cases. You know, parking maximums for food and beverage. 4 to 7 stalls per 1,000 square feet, and then the maximum is being reduced to 5 parking stalls per 1,000 feet. So there's a lot of feedback that's quite a bit lower than what they are today. And then just
One more time, I'm sorry, I was cutting. The thought is it's reducing them too much, the parking maximum?
correct, yeah.
Okay.
The reduction of the current maximum being 150 to 175%, and the proposed new parking maximum being 125 to 150%. And then some exceptions for like medical being 5,000 max reduction. And I could kind of go on, I'll probably summarize this in an email, but the last one would be just the drive-throughs and how they are going to be functionally pretty limited in the MXN and the MXA zones by the form-based restrictions, and also the 200-foot setback from residential uses, because we're going to put more residential uses into these zones. So it casts the distance where a drive-through could be actually improved further and further out.
Drive-through restaurants, that would count.
Yeah. Yeah, restaurants, I guess pharmacies.
Do you have a recommendation that maybe a building form that a drive-through be allowed inside a building footprint, like you might see in downtown for banks, those types of things? Or are you recommending no restrictions?
Well, I think maybe on the MXN, it's 200 feet from a residential use or zone. It's in the zone, the feet is challenging because you can do a residential use in a commercial mixed-use building. So I think that it should be 200 feet from, or not necessarily 200 feet, but a certain distance from a residential zone, remove the use restriction.
I think the uses is something we definitely need to think about, because if you were to require, so interestingly, this just came up, like what is 300 feet? It's a block, one block. So 600 feet is 2 blocks. And so if requiring 200 feet setback in zones, okay, that's one thing, but we like uses are all within the zone. And so can you even build what it is that you could do if you make these setback requirements? I mean, the same could be true with shelters, and we're watching that conversation play out right now of why 300 feet and what does 300 feet mean, and where would we provide transitional housing for folks. But like, whatever you were to think about it, and I think Lindsay's done some work on this, like, what if it was a bar? He said that a bar can be within 300 feet of XYZ uses. Like, can we even, what is actually the size of our city and our block width? And then how do we figure out where those uses can go? And then using like a block as kind of an example, not just 300 feet, but they're kind of proxy for each other. And then maybe some places it should be 2 blocks or 3 blocks, but really thinking about that distance and how long it takes to transition from one use to the other, one zone from another, to get that kind of experience that's appropriate around there. So thanks. Yeah, that's good. Other folks just jump back in.
Well, we have an opportunity to talk about the shelter, 300-foot separation during this meeting or a future meeting.
You can, as much as it's useful, as it relates to the zoning code rewrite module 1, module 2. I mean, today they're finishing up presentation or notes, comment. We had 20 questions back to staff.
Additional public comments
Additional public
today.
comment, and then deliberations on
Monday.
Monday. So those experts are there at that conversation, so we could try our best to talk about it, but in the future state too, I think is maybe more aligned with how we should bring that into the conversation.
Yeah, I guess, I mean, it depends on how granular we want to get with our comments during meetings like this. If it makes sense to have a discussion about whether or not a block separation is the appropriate way to provide, limit impacts and things like that, or if that is even, warranted in our module 2 discussion or a future discussion. I guess that's the big.
Yeah,
main
kind of
question.
like when do we get to use it?
It's applicable now because we're having that conversation, that local conversation about it now. I wonder if now is a good time to have a constructive conversation about it before, like while it's on everyone's mind.
Let's make sure everyone who has something to think about has a chance. Maybe start with the zones, like back to module 2, thinking of things like where do we want more intense zones to be. Module 2 is then kind of like, and what's in that zone, like what are the dimensional standards, and then uses as like that next part.
Yeah.
Because we could also don't do it like in module 3, like what's our process. How would we ensure that quality control on all of this? So,
Byron, are you like, I thought I was just gonna sit and listen, but I don't know if I'll have questions. Are you asking or thinking about having a conversation that's like a little more 30,000 foot, which is to say, if we had a use that could potentially impact a neighborhood, whether that's a shelter or, well, like a bar or like thinking about like Franklin Street, like something that neighbors would say, oh, this might be an unusual thing in our neighborhood that would have a more of an impact. Are you thinking about a higher level conversation to say, as a community, do we think that it's a certain number of square feet would provide that buffer versus a wall would provide that buffer versus both of those things would be required? Are you thinking like a higher 30,000 foot level conversation about
I
as
think
a
that's a great
community,
way to
what
have
do we
that conversation,
value?
actually. Yeah, because I mean, it's sort of topical with the lack of granularity or maybe the conflict between the Euclidean zoning model and the development pattern question, because we can get a little bit more philosophical about those things when we're talking about whether or not the code that we're writing is doing an adequate job of mitigating impacts. So if we have that broader conversation, I think it's topical to what we're already talking about, but we could get really specific about it and talk about module 2 items too. But I like your first idea though better.
yeah, and then there's the part of mitigating impacts and then encouraging the types of incentives that we want, like the quality buildings, the variety in housing, the great places to be.
Talk to the uses that you want to see
Mhm.
in certain places.
Yeah, so
I
that
would
it's-
say that's come up pretty regularly is when we do a deep dive in the allowed use table, kind of helping with the process. I'm kind of the champion of this, so no wonder we're behind. But when we dive into the use table, we often have questions of, well, why isn't this even conditional in this zone? And there's several uses that I don't have readily available, but I think hopefully you're hearing that and hopefully we're feeling the same way that we can be a little bit more generous on the allowed use tables, especially as it relates to R2 and R3. And if that requires a conditional use, I think that's a more organic, maybe way of going about it than having some sort of distance that would feel probably pretty arbitrary in some instances. But,
Right. Yeah, and there is that distinction between R1, R2, R3, and allowed uses that you wouldn't condition, like
yeah.
R1, you would want to mitigate a variety of uses versus when you get to a townhouse or a 46 unit apartment or where that type of development is happening more permanently, you maybe would expect, like, of course there's going to be a bar, but there maybe not won't be a bar in the area. It just seems like a bar.
Yeah, just
Thursday, we're almost a happy hour Friday.
you want to leave that door open or at least cracked so that a neighborhood or a community can say, we love what the Easton has in the Roosevelt Market. How can we do that here? And I think that that door needs to be cracked open a little bit more generously than the code. So hopefully you're hearing.
Yeah, so where do we put uses?
It
Residential zone.
sounded like you were talking about.
Yeah, okay, there we go.
Specifically, so. if
Great.
we just big- Why are they this way? You want it.
Are we getting to some of the good stuff?
Get into good
Oh,
stuff.
Okay,
we do have a hand from Richard.
I gotta get to it, but I.
Hey, thank you. I appreciate it. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yeah, okay, great. I wanted to jump in, hearing about allowed uses and looking at what's going, so residential is one thing, and that's of course, in some neighborhoods, that's all we are confronted with for the most part, and maybe commercial. Looking at South Boise, Southwest Boise, they're confronted with a lot of industrial. And I personally think that the conditioning is essential, and we're kind of coming into a problem from my perspective when we look at the folding of industrial zones, currently the light industrial and then T1 and T2 all into the same category moving forward, and not dealing with specifically how do we mitigate impacts. Because for instance, the T2 zone is clear in that it shouldn't be next to residential uses. That may or may not be true with what is currently light industrial. I think having been involved in what happened with Blue Valley and now may be happening down by Indian Hills subdivision, in which we have A2 zoning being proposed to become light industrial. I think it's really super critical that we deal with all of these industrial allowed uses, including potentially landfills, which are, I've been told that might be removed, but right now that's an allowed use, not even conditional, if I remember right, in our industrial zones. So yeah, I understand a lot of us are not confronted with industrial uses, but a lot of us are as well, and especially in the growing parts of the city to the south and southwest. And then in terms of just stepping back, let me just jump in here. My neighborhood and other neighborhoods that are on the fringe, we feel, it's kind of odd that there isn't a transitional zone between, say, on the edge where we still have a lot of farmland uses or non-foothills sage step uses. And so it's odd to try to shoehorn us into, what may be going on more into the core. And some of this comes about, say, the State Street corridor. Just recently, well, it's been a year now, we have, first of all, we have all these nicely developed plans for the State Street corridor, but we're approving developments without the basic elements of those plans, like without the 12-foot multimodal path. And so when we talk about these kind of zones going forward, that would be an instance of having specific zones for something like the State Street corridor, to ensure that is written into code, because otherwise, the developers, we just have two of them, they're trying to wiggle out of it. It looks like at this point, we might be holding them to actually doing it, but it's not in code. So it's a problem. So thank you all. I will mute myself now.
Thank you. Thanks, Richard.
Yeah, so my aha, as has already been mentioned, is people really care about parking.
Yeah, let's talk about parking. How do they care? In which way?
Well, so I think, so many people, I think people have they have an expectation about, they have a view of how parking ought to look in their street, and they're worried about adding more people living into that area, and how that's going to affect their ability to either have the appearance of cars parking on the street, or kind of which just seems unsightly to people, or that they won't be able to find a place to park on the street. That was what I heard. I was a little surprised, because that's not my experience in our neighborhood, but we talked about this and when looked some of the areas, I kind of get it, but so I guess I have two thoughts. So one is that, I think there are some, like,
we do, I mean, I guess my view is like, we do want infill development and parking is gonna change. And so I'm okay with it being a little bit harder to find a parking space because I would like to have more housing in our existing neighborhoods. And for me, that's a trade-off. And I think, you know, reasonable people can disagree about that, but you know, that's where I kind of come down. I'm okay with having it, you know, maybe having to park half a block away from my house if it turns out my neighbor's having a party or something. So I guess that's just, I think how we resolve that, I think it's highly contested. People care a lot about it.
Yeah, and absolutely, and I would add in too, there's a lot of comments that we've heard about, well, yeah, that sounds great to reduce parking, but where is the transit that would support my neighborhood having developments that come through that can accommodate less parking, so people have, okay, they're buying less cars, but we can't get anywhere because we're not on the transit line. When will the transit come? So
yeah, and I don't think, I mean, so, yeah, I think that's true. I think, you know, we're underserved, you know, we don't, I don't think the transit ferry is coming tomorrow and gonna bring light rail down every, I think we're stuck with the transit system that we've got.
Right, well, so can we,
Did you have a second point?
Well, yeah, that was the aha.
yeah, that's great, because I think we have some thinking that, I think it would be worthwhile to bring up, like how we're thinking about the transit corridors. Because we do have 3 best-in-class routes that we could think about, at least like we have that, we know we have that, we're not gonna wait for that yet. And then there's the anticipated maybe where routes would be conversation.
Yeah, we could vector into talking about transit and, you know, what's happened since COVID and what we think is realistic. But parking to me, so that was my aha. You know, the thing I care about is the new zoning code going to allow for more infill development in a way that's reasonable and not too expensive. And so that's where my
because parking might have to go underground or.
No, it's just like, so this is somewhat, it's like there's the tension between, I don't want parking. I don't want more cars competing on my streets for parking, traffic. I don't like cars, and cars come with more housing. So more housing means more cars. So I don't want any more housing. It's like so that logic is defensible. I think, you know, many people, you know, there are a lot of people, you know, houses with one person that don't use their car that much. So I would contest the underlying assumption there, but like, there are people around this table I know who disagree with me on that. And so I think the thing that so in terms of responding, what was in module 2, there were just a number of things there which sort of said, hey, you know, we're going to lower the minimum lot size. So that for something, oh, that's great. You know, oh, we're going to allow, you know, triplexes. Like, oh, that's great, more density. But then there are a bunch of, so that's good for my agenda, right? Bad for the no more parking agenda. But there are also all these other rules that make it harder to do those things, right? So there were things in there that said, oh, you can, you know, we're going to lower the minimum lot size to 4,000, but we're going to constrain it based if the other lots near you are also big and you can't subdivide. And so so I just want to like tease out, like we got to decide, do you want more density or not? You know, because if you want it, then like, let's have rules that people can actually implement that will actually give you what you say you want, not say, well, we're going to kind of give you the ability to do more development, but then we're going to have all these conditions that make it super hard.
Right.
Because we're not getting, then we're not getting the more, you know, the additional housing, the smaller units that I would like to see.
Right.
So I just think we got to be
that like proof and concept.
Yeah, and I just want to acknowledge that there is like a reasonable position on the other side, which is, and so how do we navigate that? And there were certain neighborhoods that really cared about this issue. And so are there ways that we can, I think this goes to the, can we kind of fine tune our zoning a little bit that maybe allows for people who, you know, how do we balance those differences in kind of a democratic way?
And you're specifically talking about residential parking requirements.
Correct.
Okay.
Yeah, I'm just in that. I mean, I know there are.
Because we heard some about commercial, and so
Yeah, and
I want to make sure that we're covering both of those categories.
Right. I agree with those positions, but I'm just talking. I'm trying to kind of zero in on the housing side.
Yeah, if we're talking parking, I had kind of the same people are very passionate about their parking. And I think the thing that's fascinating is that in conversation, folks immediately go to their personal situation. Well, I have 3 kids, we have 5 cars. And there's got to be some way to communicate that some of the type of housing products that we're encouraging with the rewrite are not those types of homes. And the parking requirement that we're encouraging at 1 space per residential unit is going to feel very drastic to a lot of households. I wonder a way, and this might be terrible, Donald might slap me if I say this, but one of the things that came up was, well, is there a way of meeting in the middle to where you almost have a progressive parking requirement like you find in multifamily housing based on the housing type? So if we're seeing triplexes and townhomes that are 2-bedroom units, that's an easier argument to make with this community that you need 1 car, not 2. So I don't know if that's a space to explore, if you're seeing that, but
We all know we
It
can't
might be
go
worth-
our way out of Hardin. So.
right. But Daniel, did you-
Yeah, no, I think that's one potential way, right? But then also, you know, if there's a neighbor, I also think about this, you know, there were some, you know, Houston is an interesting example. They allowed for much, you know, to subdivide into much smaller lot sizes, right? So their neighborhoods really changed. They got a lot more housing, but they allowed to go for people to subdivide into pretty small ones. I forget what it is, 2,000 square feet or something like that. But they did allow some neighbors, you could opt out. So if you could organize all the neighbors on, it was a fairly small area, you could opt out. And so there were some neighborhoods. So I'm just trying to like what's the escape valve? So I think there are a lot, I think in the Central Bench, there are a lot of, I think those neighborhoods already are changing. You know, but there may be, I just want to be sensitive to, there are some communities who's like, no, we really like this the way it is. And, you know, maybe if we had a citywide policy that more defaulted towards more density, but there was a way that you could opt out if everybody, you know, if a supermajority in your block or 2-block area decided they wanted to opt out. I don't know if that's a good idea or not, but I know that was
Yeah,
what they
no,
did in Houston.
what we don't want to do is creating zones.
Right, so, but at the
But
same
then how do you
time,
write,
how do you
capture
tailor,
yeah.
because, you know, you have a vocal minority, and it's like, that doesn't want this change because of how it affects their neighborhood. So there, you know, maybe there's some way to,
Yeah.
I don't know.
So, you know, kind of a sort of
Oh, I have a few, because I'm still thinking about what we heard and what do we think, and sometimes that overlaps because you hear your perception and
you're like, yes, I got it.
yeah, so I don't have a good answer
And
to
then you hear
that.
something else, and you're like, all right.
But you know what, something Marissa said early on, I was fortunate to be able to go to 10 of the 11 public meetings.
Wow.
And very,
Wow.
well, not
Number
to
one.
brag, it's just
Super
because.
committee
Make
member.
sure you get it, Tumblr.
Yeah, but it just-
Hydrate. If you're doing all that.
And like I said, you know, it just reinforced to me that we live in our own little bubbles. Like I am in the Southeast. And so one of the things on my list of comments here is from my Southeast neighbors. They're like, well, we don't have that much open land in the Southeast. And I'm like, oh, that's a good point. I don't really know what's open land in Southeast. So that's one of the responses. It's like, well, why are we doing this? Because we don't have a lot of Southeast. But then, you know, a lot of open land in Southeast, but then you go to somewhere like the Southwest or the Northwest meeting, which was the one I was most disappointed, but that I didn't get to, where there is open land. And so how that differs from community to community. And so I was really glad that, you know, Tim, as the committee, said multiple times, this is not a cookie cutter answer. So my list here means I'm going to go all over the place, so forgive me. You know, how, maybe not in this meeting, but in a future meeting, how do we come up with that answer? Because that's something that we always get back to because we have so many different opinions. So it's probably not appropriate for this meeting, but it fits with some of the community perceptions that you hear of what's the next steps in the process. Because we have feedback from module 1, feedback from module 2. We have a lot of comments. You know, how are those comments going to be incorporated? This is module 2 into this big fat document that people are going to understand because.
Well, and come together as a community
Yeah, I'm sure we'll never come together. But you know, if we just.
You know,
get
but I
together-
do think
yeah.
there is kind of a higher level thinking of like, okay, conceptually and in reality, like this is the community we are. And then do I see myself in that corner?
Yeah, 'cause it's a lot to digest, especially if you haven't dealt with this a lot. Like I thought I had a tiny bit of knowledge. And so out of all those meetings, by the time I went to the 10th meeting, I think, oh, you think I would understand zoning at this point, you know? But one of the things that struck me from all the meetings is there's a lot of confusion as to what zoning can and cannot do. So, for instance, in my area of the world, parking, right? So everybody has parking issues. But is parking something, you know, we could totally solve zoning? Or is there some way to do code compliance? You know, like for instance, somebody moves from this section of the block to another section, you know, when they meet their 48 hours or whatever it is. You know, are there other ways in addition to parking, in addition to zoning to alleviate some of the parking situations that we have? And that might not be something we could address, but it's something that might need to be brought forward at some point.
Well, I might butcher this and you guys can get back to Tim and tell him that I got to work on thinking through things the way that he does. He kind of touched on that with us today. He had a staff meeting with everybody and, you know, kind of shared his impressions, 60 days on board, days to get to know the city, get to know the work that we're doing. And kind of touching on that whole, another issue that you're bringing up of, it's really hard to use zoning as the way to figure out these issues. And, you know, having attended some of the meetings and kind of hearing the conversation happening, I was like, that people are going to argue about zoning, even if we don't have public meetings about zoning, because you're trying to pack a lot into what you want that zone to do. And so his of the zoning and land use type conversation and thinking more about like the design of the city. What kind of change are we going to experience in the next 20 to 30 years in population growth and environmental changes and the development that comes along with that? And how do we first step back and say, well, what's the design? What's the concept of the city? And then use the tools that we have through planning and zoning and land use, you know, in ways to know that then we're going to build that city. And it's early in, you know, that process as a department of how we go about and structure ourselves in that way. But it really, your comments kind of resonated exactly with what he's kind of brought to the table too. Of planning's hard. You can go to 10 out of 11 meetings and walk away from scratching your head, but you know, I think with what you guys have already brought up today, I mean, I've been back 2.5 weeks and I can't think of many other touch points, topics that I've heard from staff and then attending to the meetings myself that have been brought up and that we're trying to think about. Unless you guys are identifying staff-wise, and online too, we haven't had a chance to.
But could I add something?
Yeah.
To Jessica? Roberta, I just wanted to recognize something that I heard from your comment, maybe, and I don't know if this is exactly what you were getting at, but I know that something that came up a lot in the community meetings, right, with this sort of confusion, and this is Lena talking, by the way, for folks that are online, confusion over what zoning can and can't do. So we hear a lot of very legitimate concerns of like, well, this is all fine and good, but if you're increasing density, then what does that mean for the school district? And it's not a very satisfactory answer to just say like, well, that's the school district, right? So there has to be a recognition that like, no, that's not necessarily in the structure of what a zoning code does, but that doesn't mean that we just say like, well, we don't have to think about that. And yes, we're getting feedback from our partners, but like, maybe a question is thinking past the zoning code rewrite. It's like, how do we tie that conversation back to say, yeah, we do need to think about these other elements of like how we grow and how do we continue that conversation in a productive way, but also recognize that like, this is what zoning is and this is what it is not as a tool.
And I want to just give another example that we've heard a lot of people say, oh, when I went to the housing meeting at the library, it was a different conversation because we put it in the context of our affordable housing and the programs we're working on to advance affordable housing outside of the zoning code. And I think that's sometimes important for us to think about is like, we'll have a land use, but then we have to have programs that support everything else we're trying to achieve. And the land use is just one piece of it. So we know affordable housing is an issue. Therefore, the city is working on helping to produce 1,250 affordable units, or we're trying to preserve 1,000 units through other channels outside of zone.
Well, Roberta, you have a couple things. So, okay, and then
So-
Ian was next, and then
We haven't talked about it.
the hand up there, and, okay, we'll get,
And,
make a list.
sorry, people.
No.
It was pretty quiet the first year, so.
I think there's a bit of that for all of us, too.
Yeah,
Like, yeah, we can engage.
So one of the big things that came up that I observed is this confusion as to how Idaho transit and the city is restricted. And that's a really big deal because, you know, I volunteer with a lot of climate groups, and transit's gonna help climate, and as is other things. And so how we, based on what I just said, how zoning isn't gonna handle transit, but transit is something that I'm very personally concerned about, because if you have ever been forced to take the access bus, it's exceedingly difficult. And so I had to do that for close to a year. And so you can't get anywhere. So then, you know, when you talk about in these meetings, you know, taking care of all the groups that we have in town, like the disenfranchised. So I don't know, because it's very frustrating not to provide us a solution. That's why I like to listen. People have that sometimes. You know, how we could help the public understand, because that's what, you know, that this zoning is sort of this chicken and egg thing with transit. And then the other thing, you know, we all focus on parking. I do like the idea of different economic levels for housing. A lot of the meetings I went to, actually 10 of 11 meetings I went to, there were like no young people. If there was anyone less than 40 there, and I'm like way over 40, you know, it was a shock. And so in my little bubble of life, that's what I hear from young people. It's like, we can't buy anything, you know, and you hear that from the parents. So how we balance multiple units, that's going to be acceptable to the older generation, you know, in general, is really important to me. And we don't have kids, so I don't know why I care. But it's important to the community, and you know, trying to figure out how we do some sort of multi-level house. And I think that's it for now.
Yeah, great thought.
So I'm going to take a step back from parking and talk about something we really haven't talked much about is open natural spaces.
Yeah.
That, you know, we came up in some of the conversations, but I think kind of the conversation that Tim want us to have was, you know, how do we go beyond the, you know, nitty-gritty of the zoning code, and how do we think about what we want the city to be, and really what we think we enjoy, at least what I moved here for, you know, those open spaces, parks, river, redevelop, those pathways, and talk about how we achieve that with the zoning code, because as we all said, the zoning code can't do everything, it can do some of it. I don't have an answer. I just kind of
No, this is a good one because you know, we are puzzling on this one as well. So currently in code, you guys correct me, or maybe even you should just start this up. We kind of treat all open space like open space, and that could be a golf course, that could be a school park, that could be a real park that Parks and Rec manage, or it's like a conservation area. And then with you know, Tim coming and from the southeast and Sprawlanta, you know, his planning experience, he's like, wow, there's a lot of desert here. Like, where does what is the boundary of the city and how, where do we stop growing and what are the other cities around us doing? And I've heard him often, talk about like, how do we protect these natural resources? How do we not do what so many other cities have done, which is just continue to build out until we realize we can't build any further.
Rock out there too, which is hard to deal with. Which is
Rattlesnakes.
There's probably what's saving us out.
Yeah. Yeah. So we have to somehow through the zoning code, or I think as a part of this rewrite through the process, like also think about our area of impact, County and annexation in general, and how is open space related to that? How is growth in general related to that? But also those are some of the areas that haven't been developed. And so we don't have solutions on that one. So we have to go back to the drawing board.
Yep. We have Marissa.
Yeah.
If we want to have Marissa, if you want to go next.
Okay, so I was thinking about this on my drive back. But one of the issues that keeps coming up in our NA meetings when we discuss the zoning code is how does Blueprint Boise fit into this? Because even though we've heard that this is supposed to address the disconnect between zoning and Blueprint Boise, people are not understanding how that is happening. And so when you look at Blueprint Boise, it actually is broken up into different sections of the cities. It addresses different things, like Southwest is supposed to maintain the rural characteristics of our community. And how does a one size fits all zoning rewrite or upzone address any of that? And so I think that's something that needs to be talked about a lot more, like exactly how are we bringing Blueprint Boise into our zoning code, and what does this mean for different areas? Because the areas of the city are not the same, and they have not historically been the same. They're not growing the same. We don't all have access to the same amenities. We don't have the same ability to be able to walk to work or walk to downtown or whatever. And I really do feel that it's important that we address that a little bit more.
Richard.
Then here you can unmute Richard.
Yes, thank you. I'm unmuted. Okay. Exactly what Marissa said. I think that's super important. Neighborhood plans, planning areas, they're all part of the comprehensive plan. And I just haven't seen any of that really so far discussed in terms of our rewrite. A couple of other things. I think whenever we do public outreach, we just have to expect that people are going to come and may be passionate and may have a lot of ideas, but they're going to start always at the beginning. And so this idea that we're going to discuss just one module or whatever just probably is not realistic, because people are going to be coming with, wanting to start from the beginning and having lots of questions and detailed questions. And that will require going back to other sections. And of course, that's always going to be a challenge. In terms of, I'm happy to hear, this is something we've been calling out here for decades and decades, since I was a kid in the 70s, in terms of trying to hold Boise from sprawling. Out here in my area, it's kind of the last ditch efforts. But to the south, what do we have? 6 or 7 fire stations planned for growing to the south. And that's the cost of sprawl, right? In terms of dollars, those are expensive, let alone all the other costs. So I'm glad to hear that we might actually finally be talking about that, because otherwise we say, oh, well, density should prevent sprawl. But unless we have some policies to do it, growth is not a zero-sum game. There's plenty of people that move here that will want to move out south, and plenty of other people who may want to move into an apartment. So one does not cancel out the other, unfortunately. And then again, the transit, it's so frustrating to hear about our transit-oriented density out here in my neighborhood along State Street, because there is no actual plan, any viable plan for transit. Now we hear all the time, oh, this is transit served, because there is a bus that runs down State Street, but there are no bus stops. In my neighborhood, there's only one bus stop in my neighborhood along a 2-mile stretch or so, and there's none planned. And so we're actually designing these apartments, and they get sold to City Hall this way as, you know, transit-oriented apartments, you know, and they're going to have bicycle, you know, covers, and they're going to, you know, have little LED lights the same when the next bus is coming. Well, the bus will come, but it's not going to stop. And, you know, it's just, and these are not issues of density. It's not a chicken or egg thing. This is issues of policy. You know, we've gotten 1,500 new apartments along State Street in my neighborhood. And if you add a little bit of Garden City, you go on, and it's just, you know, we'll have to, it could be decades before we actually even have a bus stop. So that's super frustrating. And I think that, you know, it really erodes public trust. And when we talk about kind of this transit that doesn't actually exist, and maybe if there were more elements in code, maybe we could actually move toward that. And then finally, I don't actually understand the comments about zoning not addressing density. My understanding was, even, you know, if you go to LUPA and just kind of planning in general, zoning is supposed to deal with density and service providing. So, and that is something I thought that traditionally it was used for. So that kind of surprises me. I understand that the city, you know, that we have political subdivisions, and the school district might say no comment on a development, but that doesn't mean that the services are actually there. So, thank you.
Thanks, Richard. Do you want to
I don't want
talk about zoning and density, or?
Yeah, I don't want to get too into the weeds tonight, because this should really be a discussion that you all are leading, I think, but, and I don't know if I'm responding to this with Richard, so we don't need to do like a whole back and forth, but just to clarify a little, the comment that I was making to Roberta was that, you know, we've had some specific questions about where in the zoning code is there a specific plan for building new schools, for example. And of course, a long-range plan for the school district is something that the school district does, and it is a different process. But that doesn't mean that it's not an important consideration for how we think about the zoning code. And the zoning code is a tool that is interrelated with those things. All of these aspects of government are interrelated. So how do we address those comments in a meaningful way with regard to the zoning code, while also having clarity around what zoning and development codes do versus what the school district does? That's what I'm referring to.
Yeah, and I think the other word too, that just because you say something is a zone doesn't mean that density happens overnight.
Right.
I see you have your hand up, and then Brad. And I was doing really good with names. Francis, gosh. Yes, okay.
Just
1, 2, 3.
A couple of comments. I attended 4 of the meetings and 1 online. A little bit online, one was on that. But wasn't surprised about the parking. Wasn't surprised at all. Folks that I spoke to that live up near the HP campus were opposed to any parking reduction. In large part, their claim was lack of reliable transit, right? And that's just that west side. When you go, I mean, maybe the question should be, how many of you have spent any time on your bike or in a car in Southwest Boise, Overland and 5 Mile? There's no transit out there. And the way that area has been developed, I'm sorry, but it's a mess. It's not walkable. It's a mess, in my opinion. I think I was thinking about your comments, and like, maybe, you know, we should, I like the idea of progressive parking requirements, but I have found that the folks that I've talked to that are opposed to any parking reduction are slightly older than me. And I don't know if it's a generational, just because, you know, folks have grown up with cars. Some of us have opted, and depending upon where we live, opted to take other sources of transportation if they are available. So I think maybe that needs to be kind of looked at a little closer. And then I was really disappointed in some of the just bad, disrespectful behavior by some of these meetings that I went to. And I would say the one thing that I learned at least 3 of those meetings is the lack of education. And by no fault is it of the individuals that were asking the questions. This is something that they are very passionate about and they have just jumped in. But they haven't taken the time, for whatever reason, to understand, for example, the schools. I mean, that was in the Northwest area where they're asking about schools, and I'm just like, anyway. So the schools, the transit, there was comments about ADUs. I think there's an opportunity for educating our community, and maybe that's a continued education, how that looks like and who's responsible for doing it. I haven't got that far, but I definitely think that there is a huge need there because folks come and they are so upset, but they haven't really looked at the bigger picture. And then the last thing I will say is one of the things that I constantly heard was, I don't want you guys doing anything. I don't want to change. Like, I bought this property for this reason. Fabulous. That's great. But we are growing and we can choose to grow out or we can choose to grow up. Maybe do both, but it's happening, and we should not exempt any one neighborhood. And that's all I have.
Thanks for your time. Okay.
Boy. Sorry, probably one of the uneducated, and I jumped into this because of my own environment that I live in. But one thing I've noticed that we never talk about is ACHD and the Idaho Department of Transportation, their involvement in this. It always seems like we're developing before the roads become. I live southwest, so as everybody knows, it's blowing up out there, and all these neighborhoods are not, or the roads are not keeping up with the neighborhoods. So, and transportation's not out there. Busing. And like Richard's talked about, there's not going to be a bus stopping on State Street at 50 miles an hour. People are not, that bus is not going to be allowed to stop there. So why isn't the highway department widening the road for a bus to stop, and provide that transportation? And we can have it out here in the country. The problem, that reality is that big cities, people are leaving big cities, the density of big cities. So where are they going? They're creating a sprawl of habit. Voice is a little unique. We're not a big city, but people from New York, people from Texas, people from down south, they're coming here. Where are they going to go? It is eating up our farmland.
So interagency collaboration. Bus stops. I had it on the, checking it. How to accommodate transit and more bus stops on.
Right, yeah.
And then how do we not create the environment that people are clean?
Right,
Because
exactly, because that's what
they don't have any place to go.
I mean, we're small now, but we're creating a big city. It's happening. I mean, the reality of it is we're creating a big city, so why are we doing it? I own 13 goddamn cars. You're part of the problem.
How do
You don't see
them
it during my backyard. I have a big property and keep this stuff off the yard. I am very particular about somebody parking in front of my house. It is what it is. I've been there for 30 years. That's my problem as far as I'm concerned. So I understand what these people are, how they're acting and why they're acting that. Yeah, it's tough. I understand it's public road. People park in front of my house. It's temporary. I get over it. But I understand these people that are angry, and people that are angry are property owners. That's who's showing up. These neighborhood.
Well, I would just add though that I think there's just a lot of public anger. We're all
on the
edge
for every reason out there, from politics to war to.
Yeah, I don't think you have to own a home to be angry.
So it doesn't take much for a parking incident, or a traffic incident, or whatever, for somebody. I went to quite a few meetings too. I didn't get them all. One that I really wanted to see was the North End, and how they acted up there. I was really disappointed in the Southeast over here. It was mostly the staff. There was like 5 people who showed up for that one. So there wasn't much. The mayor was there. She left her. I do appreciate council members being there too and all that, getting their input and all that. So that's good. I rode people's butts a few times. I called out town when he was the first day, before they even introduced him.
Is he right? I'm still working on it. Yeah, you got me like on my second.
I'll never say it like that.
I'm still working on it. I think Tim
I'll
said
get over it. I mean, that's what I say. We're not Boise anymore. We are becoming Boise. It's just, we are morphing into Boise. But
I have just a quick point of information. So Transit's mode share journey to work 2017 American Community Survey for Ada County, 0.5%. Okay, bicycles 1.7%, walking is 1.5%. So it's just, so I think I think we do want to, if there are corridors where we can make transit work, I think we also just have to, it's not enough to wave our hands and say transit is going to solve this. I think, and I mean, if we were allocating resources based on utilization, we should be putting a lot more money into pedestrian and bike paths. So I sometimes, this is apropos that Richard's saying, is that we can't, there may be ways to make make people, increase state streets transit mode share above, into single digit, but we're not there yet.
Yeah, you can't just approach it one way or the other when we wait for the transit or then
density helps
out of it.
But I just think we need to look hard at the real data and look at what's happened with transit utilization post-COVID and not keep telling ourselves stories that aren't true.
Fred, did you have any other thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, I do appreciate where Tim's headed again. I mean, I've had screams about Module 1 since 2 came out. I like the idea that we're slowing down. I know everybody wants to get this over with. I get it. I wonder what I'm doing here sometimes. Like I said, I'm uneducated. I'm trying to learn. I'm getting the lingo, I'm in other meetings, I've been part of Boise working together. They've kind of got me in there too. And I'm just sitting there listening, going for it. So, but I like the fact that we're slowing down and maybe look at this upzoning, this blanket upzoning thing. I think we're very diverse throughout the city. It goes to that districting thing too. This new districting we're trying to figure out now. I think that's huge. I think that's kind of how the zoning could work too, in a sense. Every place is unique. You can try to draw a line around the different types of neighborhoods and stuff like that. I think it's very important that we look at that. I know that just makes the process of planning zoning long, but I think we need to be a little more specific in the areas of what we get away with. I think everybody wants a coffee shop 5 feet away from their house. Everybody wants that kind of stuff. Everybody wants low income housing. Everybody wants housing for the unfortunate. I know I've just spent 3 days listening to the intersection with everything. It scares the hell out of me, the whole bit of it. I see how tough that is. That's for everybody involved. So I don't think people don't want that kind of change. I just think we need to be really careful with the neighborhood and the people that have invested money in their properties. And that's what I champion is homeowners, because I am one. I'm fortunate enough that I actually have 2 homes and my child is living in one. So I don't have to worry about it, but I do have another kid too. So and she's coming up ready to get into her own. They want the American dream.
Moving back in, I don't know.
So yeah, that's rough on her. They've tried that.
Yep.
So I just want to say that I really appreciate the pause and taking another look and what Tim had said about let's look at the vision of what we want Boise to be, because it did seem like the blanket cookie cutter treatment was not really sensitive enough. And then these neighborhood association meetings and everything, and the people I've spoken to just reflected that. And I think that's where all of this, a lot of the anxiety and frustration come from, is people feeling like they're being pigeonholed and not listened to. So I'm really excited about where it sounds like this conversation is going now. I do have a few concerns, and I'm really happy to hear all the other comments, because I think in this room, there's the ability to look at things holistically and look at them from different points of view. So not getting into the parking or anything like that, I'm concerned about when and how we'll reach back out to let the community know what's happening. Because I think if they hear that they were heard and that there is now this conversation about stepping back, looking at the vision, and going to be able to handle some of the nuances of the various neighborhoods and areas, I think there would be a little sigh of relief, and some of the antagonism that's out there in the community to be alleviated. So, and then I think each of us being able to reach back out to those people we've spoken to, it would help, I guess, educate and help keep people informed. So as soon as you can let us know kind of what the time frame might be.
Yeah, let's make sure at least the last 10 minutes we kind of talk through. We don't have a slide that's like, and then what's up next is, because we, yes, it's work to do.
Oh, there's I think people are more patient once they know that something's happening that is going to be good.
Oh, yeah.
Right?
Yeah, I think definitely on that point. And then to the conversation will look a little different, because you know, what we need to kind of start from the beginning, like Bridget was saying, like model 1 was about this, model 2, and you know, zoning and all that. Hopefully we don't have to like repeat the whole process. We're actually following up then on the, like, this is what we've changed then, and this is how we see the solution hitting some of those main points that you've all been bringing up with us. You know, it looks a little bit different what the conversation is going to be, because we've been having it.
Well, I think
and hopefully we'll have another way to.
with all of the methods of communication that you used, I mean, you used reaching out to individuals, to professional folks in the industry, and I agree with Esther's comment about public education is so important, because so many people are ignorant. So perhaps there's a follow-up newspaper article or something like that, or even on NPR, you know, interviews or something like that, like what's happened since we had all these neighborhood associations, even if there's no solutions, but just to give people the gist of where it's going now. I think that would be helpful. And then I have a personal concern, and I would guess that it's reflected in some of the comments that we heard in the meetings about enforcement. So if the enforcement of the current zoning code doesn't appear to be happening in the community's eyes, then what's going to happen between now and the actual release of a new zoning code? Because their development is not stopping. So whereas you might have great ideas and concepts and design parameters coming in the new zoning code. What's going to happen between now and then, and how long is that? Is that going to be 2 years? Is that going to be 3 years? So what can the public expect? And, you know, is it just not legal for planning and zoning to begin to incentivize development or encourage development to go in the way of the new zoning code? What, I don't understand, maybe it's just because I
Or
don't
just
know,
code compliance in general.
right? Well,
What are we
complying to
doing?
the current code is different than complying to the future
Yeah, there's
code.
gonna be this awkward.
And so
period.
what happens and what will happen in these communities between now and then?
Yeah, good point.
I just want to echo that. I understand why for the delay, and I'm frustrated by it because I'm really concerned about housing prices, and I think I think if we could improve our zoning code, we could build a lot more housing in Boise in a way that met our vision. So I just think, and really it's to Francis's point too, is that the quicker we can get to a new zoning code, and if we have a new set of rules, the quicker I hope there are fewer obstacles to building the kind of housing that we all want. So there are costs, and I think I understand why things are getting stretched out, but there are costs in terms of continuing to, the status quo is not making anybody particularly happy.
Okay, so we gotta get this timeline with 10 minutes left. I also want to make sure we kind of revisit over here, so that would bring us to about 3 or 4:40, so we got 5 minutes.
We have a gentleman in the back too, that's a member of the public that may want to provide comment as well. Sorry to pick on you.
That's what she said.
Think about it.
I just found out about this today, so this is like the first I'm hearing about any of this.
All right. We'll ask for your thoughts after.
I did have one comment
Yeah.
from something that was said earlier in relation to the shelter that they're trying to appeal the permit decision right now. Something that the lawyer for the interfaith sanctuaries brought up was that shelters are only allowed to be built in, I think it's C1 through 4 zones right now. And that limits where they can be built. And that the city is not giving them any other options. And that's something that should be addressed at some point. If there's a different kind of zoning that would be better for those, what they call large congregate shelters.
Yeah, thanks for your comments. We kind of touched on it a little bit. I don't know if we're gonna be able to really dive in timelines on it, but yeah, no, thank you. And you should, because that's a part of all this. It's like a good lens to say now, like, create the great kind of code that we intended, because will this even work? Kelly, gosh.
You're close. It's Kelly. So one of the aha moments that I had, another one, was listening to the city council working session and the very negative response they had to the term neighborhood protection. And so I think that it gave them the impression that the goal was to prevent change. And on the flip side, I think it gave neighborhood associations, people who attend the meetings, the impression the goal was to not have any change. Because a lot of those people showed up to the meeting saying, how is this going to impact my neighborhood? I don't want to change. And so they're walking away with a different perception. And I think that changing the terminology would maybe help the dialogue. And Patrick, and I totally agree with what he said in that meeting. I've watched it twice now because there was a lot of things that were said in that meeting that I found interesting and a little frustrating. But he talked about, we don't want the North End to be a bubble where only wealthy people can live in it, and that we want to encourage different types of development in there. And I feel like they kind of maybe missed some of the other things that we're trying to address in the rewrite because they were so focused on that. And so just something for the future.
Could you let us know of a better word? Maybe not right now this minute, but if you think about like another way to phrase maybe the true intent.
And I know, I read, we all share a lot of stuff, right? right? And I read and so now I'm starting to really catch on to the buzzwords, And so I'm like, oh, wait a minute. Okay, so that one really hit a hot point on all the stuff that they're looking at the same things I am, right? So yeah, if there's a different way we can address it, then I think, is like new development or redevelopment in established neighborhoods. I think we're talking about it in a very holistic way. And so I think we need to something that gives that impression, that it's something a little more harmonious.
Think go over,
You
and then we
guys,
have,
and then we have one on Richard.
and then we'll. Yep. Yeah.
I'll make it quick, as a life of moment I've had since we've been talking. It
Great.
relates to the, I think the chicken and egg of the transit and the parking, which affects so many of the comments that have been thrown out, including the commercial parking maximums and the residential parking minimums. And I think a lot of what we're trying to do with the zoning code is aspirational to a future city that does have those transit but don't have today. And I wonder if there's a way to start talking about, and multitasking the distance, 300 feet, 200 feet. Could we have, distances from a transit terminal dictate what the parking minimums or maximums are allowed? So that as new terminals get added, as bus stops get added in the future, then parking minimums kick in, or commercial parking maximums, because I'm not necessarily opposed to reducing commercial parking maximums in MXN or like an MXA zone, which truly is close to a major transit hub. But to reduce a parking maximum in an MXS zone, by almost definition, everybody is driving there to do that business is different. So maybe if we start talking about tying some of the fencing of these terms to what transit is. Or could be
That's a good idea. We'll go on that probably for a few hours.
Yeah, just real quick, a comment on kind of this moment we're in with the process and the language you use. I think to me, it's really important we don't view it so much as a pause. I think what we're doing is very natural in the planning process. I use this graphic a lot of work called the content machine, where you have your process and we're in these feedback loops. We've deployed, we're analyzing, we're listening, and now we're going at it again. So it's module 2.1 or whatever you want to call it. But I think it's really important that if there's messaging that goes out to the community, that that's what we're doing. It's not a step back, it's not a pause, because there's a whole population that may go, yeah, we won,
You're right, yeah.
But yeah, I think it's really important that we are taking that, we're doing a deep dive and everything.
Yeah.
Did you take the spiral from the AIA?
May have been. Yeah.
Oh, yeah, we're gonna
We'll go Richard,
Oh, okay, thanks. Yeah, just to echo the comment I heard about parking and transit, along the State Street corridor, again, this is policy. It's not to do with density per se. It's that we don't allow HOV lanes along my, northwest neighborhood side of State Street. So we're giving away, what do they say? Giving away if you give away the milk, they won't buy the cow. I mean, that's what we're doing when we entitle by right without getting the policy changed. I'm pretty certain that if we kind of held the policy changes as needing to be changed, there would be a lot of money that would be going down to the state and lobbying for instance, allowing HOV lanes along State Street, at least in Boise. There's that, and then what was the last thing? Well, I'm sure I'll bring it up some other meeting, so that's good enough for now. Thanks.
Yeah, that's great. I lived in Seattle for 13 years, and there's a lot of HOV lanes, and I'm just trying to figure out how to.
the state prohibits funding of HOV lanes.
That's what in Sun Valley and.
Fun fact, 1 year ago, you guys told me a topic that you would like to be able to influence through the zoning code rewrite. Some of you have evolved. Some of you are still have that goal. Like,
That'd be interesting. Like, on your journey
you're
through
protecting
this.
access to green space, quality growth, thoughtful design. Like, right, like you haven't wavered, like you're there.
Well done.
It's very interesting.
Drew, thanks for coming.
Make sure you
And we'll, there'll be the notes and this will be posted online and everything. There's always like the part of the conversation where like, hey, let's revisit over here and talk about this again. Do you guys feeling like everything was captured? I know on the online you can't see the flip charts, but
It'll be in the minutes.
we'll have everything in the minutes. Because I want to talk about timeline and where we are. So from our original schedule, and that's just kind of like a best guess of how much time we need. We're kind of like right where we said we would be. I think the feedback about residential zones, more differentiation between them and mixed use zones, differentiation between, like, not that blanket approach is really kind of driving from an initial, like, go back staff and figure out what to do, need. And open space, we kind of had those up here. Like we've hit on a lot of these things too internally as staff of what we've heard from the community, and we identified ourselves as something that needs more work. So we are bringing in more staff, current planners, long range planners, housing, just all the smart minds. There's a lot of really talented folks at the city to workshop each of these areas, and we're trying to do it over the next couple weeks. Gabby and Diane just left, but I saw that she was on there with Clarion are they're in on these conversations, listening to us, and we're looking at overlays, zoning again, use types, dimensional standards, trying to accommodate the feedback. And the timeline would then be to transmit those changes along with Clarion to have them rewrite a new version of 1 and 2 and give that back to us. And then that's what we would be getting back out to the community to talk about. So it's not going to be a complete change, but we can focus in on those elements that would be a little bit different, and then present the conversion map that everyone's been looking at. Of like, now this getting a little bit closer to what we're all talking about. With that, and we haven't really figured out as staff, like, what does community engagement look like? Is it, and there's some time that staff need for rest. Of like, do we go back out in the same way? Because the conversations will look a little bit different, is there a different forum? There's more ability to meet in person, at least right now, until there's another variant, like, who knows? So we got to work on what that engagement looks like, and how, and I think, like, different forms of media, like online, NPR, or in person, or virtual. And we'll figure that out. And
all of the above.
All of the above, newsletter, postcards, that kind of stuff. So I think it only puts us about 3 weeks-ish, maybe behind of our original guess timeline. What we've really put a pause on, I think, right now is module 3, because we got to get 1 and 2 right before module 2 is a little bit of it is a different piece. It's about process. And to have both of the conversations at once is kind of like not giving that space for 1 and 2 to really digest the information and come back out with like a clear way of presenting that information. So we will get to module 3, and then looking at our full timeline of how do we bring it all together and communicate, like, this is, and with Tim, thinking on this, like, this is getting to the design of that city that we're all thinking about. And it is related to Blueprint Boise and the plans that have come since then, and the neighborhood plans. There is a way we're going to bring it all together. Just we got to get there. And I really appreciate all of your efforts in helping us in the journey along this path, because I mean, you all basically should just come to work at the city, and you are planners, you're planning, and really helpful to help us think about this too. So I appreciate that. Yeah.
So just just make sure I'm crystal clear. So you, staff will get together and you guys are going to look at these key areas the items identified on these post-its in addition to the comments that you've received.
Oh, yeah.
That's.
Yeah. So like residential zones alone is, like, there's a whole bunch to unpack, just with what you guys said, but then we've got some other thoughts too about, like, we didn't really talk about, like, within those different zones, what are appropriate heights? How do we transition within the zones? What are the setbacks? What are the allowed uses? I mean, there's just a whole bunch within residential zones, and then we get to mixed use zones, and we're looking at corridors and open space.
Yeah, and I think it's like, we're definitely hearing like high level concepts, like we want to iterate and feedback on. And some of the feedback we heard, applies to all of the zones. So like we heard, we want to have different places in the city of Boise, right? We want to have variation and unique places. So how can we go back and look at our zones and say, do we have the right zones? And if we don't, maybe we need to change a zone. And how do we make them more different, right? Because that was what we heard. We heard a lot from the community. We don't want to grow everywhere. Okay, so how can we create zones that don't have us grow everywhere, but understanding we have to grow some places. So can we grow where we have infrastructure or investment, and then only get the type of development we really want other places, right? Where it's affordable or it's sustainable or things like that. So those are some of the high level, which is I've heard mirrored a lot here, which is great. Things we're going to be trying to look at our old document and say, what are some of the solutions to these issues that were raised?
Okay, and then second, for our May meeting, will this be part of the discussion? Will you guys be coming back to us with kind of like some specific areas or information that you have taken back to Clarion, or will we just be brought into the fold after you have a draft version or whatever from Clarion?
So I think the first one is really, but if we can work with staff to come back with a proposed approach, share that with you, while at the same time, like some of this we know we need to revisit with Clarion, so like they can start off on that. But then make sure that we're all tracking with like what we bring back to you, like is this getting closer? So we really want to be able to do that by May.
I guess I would just have one question, because I like looking at data and I love to look at responses when we talk about meaningful engagement and public participation. So if there was just an opportunity for us to just get some level of results from the survey. Today when we talked about like, okay, what did we think? What was our aha moment? For me, a lot of the meetings that I went to, I heard pretty almost identical things, right? But that's for those segments of our community. And so that's, we're missing out on 3,112 comments there. So yeah, I like
like what did we miss anything in the conversation?
You'll have a summary, because that's important. So not only are we summarizing what we're hearing from you, what we heard individuals, what I heard on all my telephone calls, and all those community responses, and then also, well, here's how that information, here's how we think we need to change those things, and some high level changes of, overlays, zones. Where are we protecting? How do we evaluate those things a little bit differently? Parking. So yes, you'll have both of those, I think.
Thank you.
And the data too.
Yeah, I can send like the raw survey data, and then we'll do a full summary that includes comments, because there were other events that you all didn't attend. Obviously, there were more targeted groups that were very different. And I think you were the one that made the comment about, is it demographic? That is definitely something we heard when we spoke to younger generations. It's a very different tone and sentiment in some of these changes. So yeah, very interesting. But.
And I guess one last thing, I just want to recognize you all for all of your hard work and your patience during this process, especially during the public meetings, and the efforts that you've done on the public participation piece, the outreach. I have been watching the city for almost 2 decades, and I can say with confidence that either it just was never shared, or you guys are doing substantially more on these types of things, on these changes, proposed changes in the city than I have seen since the early 2000s. So thank you.
Agreed.
Appreciate that.
Yeah, very much.
Yeah.
Here, here.
I think part of why, just speaking for myself, but I think probably everyone else too, of like why it's really wonderful to hear that, because I know that we hear a lot of frustration from people in meetings that they're like, well, so I'm gonna come here and tell you what I think, and then you're never gonna do anything with it. And I definitely understand that frustration, especially taking a long view of history, but I also want to make it clear that like, when we have conversations and the conversations we've been having in the past several weeks, everything that we have heard has been interwoven into that conversation, whether it's the survey or a meeting, whether it's young people or older people. And like, it's something that we are actively bringing into that conversation and discussing and thinking about, and sometimes like lying awake at night thinking about. So it really is like, I appreciate your comment, and also like we really do appreciate all the people that have shown up, and especially you all, because it is not just performative, it is like truly substantive and integral to how we do our work. So it really matters.
And also that October meeting you all gave us, I think was really, remember we did talk about, like that was very helpful, and I think it kicked our butt a little bit to say we could do better. So I appreciate that too.
So I want to reiterate your comments about appreciating the engagement, because it is very difficult. And I know that we will never, ever reach 100% of the community, but not to put any pressure on you, because we all know you need a little bit of a break, but the education and outreach now, as far how critical it is, because there's been so much voicing of feedback that people hear, thank you, not just to us, because obviously, we're a part of this, but there are other people who engage. But some of the things, Deanna, I didn't remember everything you said, but Deanna and Lana, as far as things that you've heard and how that's going to be reevaluated, whether if it's in a general, because you'll be able to go through all the different comments, but just that pitch to continue that outreach and do it smooth. I know it's hard to do. People need to know, because there's a lot of people who have that feeling that, well, we said this, but they're not listening.
Mm-hmm.
And how does that not listening mean? Because not everybody, it's not going to be a perfect plan. It's going to be as close as we can get.
Yeah, I think we make that piece, how do we get back out soon? Agenda item number 1 on our meeting on Monday.
Sorry.
No, it's good. It's good because we quickly get into like, okay, now let's do the work. It's like, oh, we should let everybody know that now we're doing the work.
And I'm sure we'll get it, but at times, we all have our own opinions. But advice on how we could share it better. Like I've shared with my little bubble, and I keep trying to expand onto my bubble. And the last thing I think is, can we do this again? Can we do this hybrid? Because it really is a different dynamic when you could see people's faces, and I hopefully we won't have to go back to any isolation, but so I appreciate this meeting very much, and I appreciate the fact that for those who can't come in person, that you have offered the hybrid option, because I may not be able to come in person in the future too, so appreciate it.
And as a follow-up to the people that are online, I would appreciate feedback that you all had too. I'll go watch on YouTube. Hybrid is difficult to do.
Yeah.
The only place it's conducive to do it really well is council chambers, which is booked, during these times that we know. So this is our next best option. Obviously, we're trying to figure out some of the kinks. And we know as a city, like our investment on some of these, because people are asking for hybrid, not just this, but some of our community outreach events and whatnot as well. So we're trying to work
There's some
through.
good shared speakers that'll help a lot, with that. So.
Yes.
Can I want to give the good job to the staff sentiment. And then also, yay. And then also, because I'm a bit of a technocrat, and I do believe in public process, but I also believe in good like using your expertise, and we've all tried to get smarter on this issue, but you all have years of this. And so, and some of this is just, it's like, there's stuff that, you know, if you care about trying to, like, what are the levers that matter? And sometimes it's hard to know, right? Like, is this, if we make this change, are we going to get more density or not? You know, and so, and this is really going to make people mad, but is it worth it, you know, or is it not worth it? And so I think some of that, you know, you can, you know, is requires your expertise, and what have we learned from other jurisdictions? And so as much as, yes, I want you to listen to all of us, I also want you to, I also want to champion, and it's a little bit where I started. It's like, you know, tell us what you guys think, and then let us kind of react to that some more. And I mean, obviously, maybe it's been a little heavy with, you know, with Don and right, you know, they have a view of what they want, but I do feel like we do want to rely on your expertise in terms of putting ideas out there.
A little bit of the good stuff.
Yeah,
Okay, good.
but I'm just saying it's, you know, I like to react to your good ideas about where we ought to go.
Well, I think May we should have some stuff to bring back. I mean, yeah, that gives us a whole month. to at least start to see, are we walking, but also like, we don't want to get too far down in like what we think the recommendations would look like for the revised draft, and then, you know, come to you guys and you're like, what did you do? So yeah, we need to.
As Clarion kind of said that we would not be stepping back until we got clear to the end. Didn't they suggest that?
They
Instead of
did
jumping
suggest
back and
that,
trying to-
and we made the adjustment to say, no, the community's upset. We feel like we need to do what we intended to do, listen, evaluate that information, and make sure that we have good foundation to build upon to get to module 3. So we will go back, correct module 1 and 2, which is a lot of work.
All right, well, no, 5 on the dot. So thank you guys. Awesome to be back with all of you, and thanks for letting me jump in. Yeah.
You folks online.
Oh, folks online, you can pick up a tumbler at City Hall. We're gonna email about that. Yep. Okay.